Hello and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. We made it through 2021, you guys, and oh, what a year it's been. From the huge increase in licensed cannabis businesses, including our first recreational delivery licenses, to the groundbreaking lawsuits that could shape the way the state's marijuana industry functions, Massachusetts has seen a lot of major changes happen this year when it comes to the developing world of weed. And today's guest has been following all of it incredibly closely every single step. Joining us today to break down all the major Massachusetts pot stories of 2021 is Boston Globe cannabis reporter Dan Adams. Dan joined the Globe about a decade ago, reporting on politics, business, and alcohol, and he moved into covering the cannabis industry in 2017 when it officially kicked off. This year, Dan has continued to give the state detailed coverage of all the biggest moves in Massachusetts cannabis, including in his weekly newsletter, This Week in Weed, and his most recent report, which gave a thorough overview of what has happened since the state legalized 5 years ago. So let's see what's changed since the start of 2021 and what Dan thinks we might see in 2022. So, Dan Adams, thanks so much for joining us today. Pleasure to see you again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I don't think we've seen each other in person in years, maybe since pre-pandemic.
Yeah, it's really been too long. And, one of the things that stinks most about the pandemic is missing out on all those in-person events where you run into people. And I always say, with those conferences and things, it's not so much the panels that are prearranged where you hear the interesting stuff. It's always in those conversations when you bump into people in between sessions or afterwards. Yeah. And I really miss getting that kind of intel.
But this year, even though a lot of it's been spent inside again, a lot has happened in the world of weed, especially in Massachusetts. So I want to do a little year in review with you and look back over some of the articles that you've done from this year. Especially the 5-year in review piece that you did, because that was a really big milestone for Massachusetts. So let's start first back in January 2021. A new cannabis control commissioner came in to replace my beloved Shalene Title, who left at the end of last year. So what's the new lineup been like? What have we been seeing from this group of control commissioners that's been different from the original cast?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because it wasn't just one new commissioner that came in. We've actually had, within the last year-ish or so, 4 turnover from the original lineup. And it has definitely changed things a bit at the commission. Although I will say that the commission's job at the same time is changing a bit right now, right? I think that the early iteration of the commission was largely concerned with writing those initial regulations, and they were really starting from scratch with a lot of things, deciding how to define things, deciding which types of licenses would be offered to folks. So I think that this new commission now is really looking more at implementation, and they're also looking at legislation. It's a big change there, is that they are now going to lobby on Beacon Hill much more actively for the bills that they'd like to see. They're going to go to lawmakers at the state level and say, this is what we need to carry out our mission as a regulatory agency. In the past, the original lineup of the commission hadn't been able to come to a consensus about how to do that kind of lobbying, and they did not really act as a coordinated unit. And so you would see different commissioners going to speak with legislators, sometimes, bearing different messages of what they were looking for and what they supported or didn't support. And I think lawmakers found that a bit confusing. And so now, like you said, it's been 5 years since legalization. And as some of the problems and shortcomings in the industry and obstacles to entrepreneurs of color, things like that, as all that has come into focus, I think the commission now is going to be looking to the legislature to give them some more tools to solve those problems.
And there's definitely been some movement, which we'll speak about as we go through the months. There's been some movement towards whether the Senate will vote to allow, certain powers to go to the commission over things like the HCAs, the host community agreements, which are essential for any businesses to open in Massachusetts. So I'm really glad that we have reporters like you who go to every weekly meeting that the Cannabis Control Commissioners have and wraps it all up for us in a nice little bow.
Unfortunately, like you said, because can be a kind of a technical subject, sometimes when you read the more local reporting on it, you will see stories where they're sort of repeating what public officials said about something, but they don't really understand the significance of it,
Right.
and it just sort of even further confuses it for folks.
There's no better example than the next big piece of news that happened in January, which was the Commonwealth Dispensary Association lawsuit against the state was dropped. This was another really big story that was really, really great to have you kind of pick apart for us as it was happening. Can you explain sort of what was going on with that lawsuit?
Sure, that was definitely one that needed a little bit of explanation, but also I think I agree with you, was hugely significant, kind of actually a watershed moment in the story of cannabis in Massachusetts. So essentially, what happened is the Cannabis Control Commission created a new kind of delivery license, these so-called delivery operator licenses, and they would essentially allow companies that get this license to act like a marijuana store without a storefront, meaning they could order bulk, wholesale quantities of product from suppliers, so they could go to a grower and get like many, many pounds of it, package that cannabis and sell it themselves. That's
Mhm.
different from the other kind of delivery license that had previously been conceived, which was a marijuana courier. That's sort of more like an Uber Eats scenario. That's
Right.
just a driver going to a store to pick up an order that's already been prepared for you, that's waiting on the shelf. This is more like you're running the store yourself. And the idea was, let's award these licenses for the next 3 years only to equity applicants. We haven't seen the kind of participation in the industry that we'd like to. It's still very much dominated by these larger interstate investor backed, white owned companies. That's falling short of our mandate. Let's really do something aggressive here. Let's carve out a window where equity applicants will really have a chance to get a meaningful slice of the pie in this industry,
Mhm.
which is what state law says they're supposed to get. And the existing retailers were very unhappy about this new license. They felt like this is a new kind of competition for us that has the unfair advantage of, they're not operating a store where people are going to line up on the sidewalk. There's no consumer interactions there. So they get to set up, they're sort of thinking, hey, it's going to be way easier for them to get set up on the municipal level. There'll be less opposition. It's just a warehouse with
Uh-huh.
some delivery vans coming and going. They're going to get in there and they're going to run circles around us. They're going to be able to bring products to people's doors. And we, meanwhile, have to work with these couriers to do delivery, which is not as profitable for us. And, basically just saying it's unfair. So they filed this lawsuit against the state, kind of throwing a bunch of different claims at the wall about why this whole licensing scheme was illegal, and just sort of trying to, protect their place in the market, I think. And also because they felt really strongly that the regulation as written was not legal. But ultimately, activists brought so much pressure around this in support of this kind of pro-equity licensing policy that most of the companies in the industry association that filed it got cold feet. I shouldn't say most, excuse me, but I should say a significant number
Mhm.
of companies that had once been members of the Commonwealth Dispensary Association suddenly started dropping out because they were, I think, feeling really, pressured. They were feeling really exposed. People were talking about, organizing a boycott around this. So I think that spooked some of the companies, and they said, "Wait a minute, are we on the right side of this thing?" And they
Right.
ultimately withdrew that lawsuit and left that association significantly diminished in terms of its size. And so that was a moment where I think the activist side of the cannabis community would tell you that they scored a major victory.
I think you're right. I think that they seem to work very hard for their platform, and it's one that you can see many of the same characters for years and years and years if you closely watch the way that the Massachusetts cannabis industry moves. After the CDA dropped that lawsuit, we saw another major win for activists, for folks who are trying to question the status quo of the laws and the rules as they are, when Northampton dropped their fees of impact for new cannabis businesses. These are major fees on top of the 3% fees that cannabis businesses are required to pay.
So at the state level, there's essentially a 17% tax on recreational marijuana sales. At the local level, there's usually a 3% further tax, local tax on those retail marijuana sales at the register, charged to the customer. But then, in addition to that, there's a provision in state law that allows municipalities to charge the marijuana businesses so-called community impact fees. And the idea in the law, at least, was that these fees would go to offsetting any impacts that these businesses had. And they capped the value of those fees at 3% of a company's annual revenue. What has happened in reality is that almost every community, not all, but almost every community, has basically just charged businesses that maximum 3%. And they haven't
Hmm.
really taken it and, delineated it, broken it out and said, these are the impacts you're having. And this is why we need this money to cover these impacts. Drug use is going up, whatever the problem is, you're causing it. We can show that. And here's some money to remediate it. And many, many communities, again, not all, but many communities will just take that money and more or less, spend it on whatever, or
Hmm.
spend it on projects that, have only a very spurious connection to the and some businesses are now getting tired of this, but I don't want to skip ahead too
Sure.
far
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. We're getting to the good stuff. But Northampton dropping that impact fee joins one other town, I believe. Lee is the
Yes,
only other town.
those are the two I've heard of. Yeah, right.
Hmm.
So these two communities have basically now come forward and said, look, we can't really, see any reason to keep charging this money. You're not really having any special impact on the community, more so than any other business would. If we're not charging other businesses these kinds of fees, you're not really doing anything here negatively to the community. So they've now dropped that, and that's going to save those companies, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in fees. It
Yeah.
could also, potentially cut some community organizations off from funding that they had enjoyed,
Sure.
although it was never going to be permanent.
It's been a very interesting one to follow as folks go back and forth on these different fees that cannabis companies should pay or should not pay. And as we see the law sort of get hashed out, it's interesting to me to see the kinds of towns that decide that they want to drop these fees in favor of allowing more companies to be able to thrive. And then what towns really seem to put up a very, very strong edge against that. In April, you published a very interesting story about the owner of STEM, Caroline Pignot, who is suing the city of Haverhill, which is her host city, for the impact fees. So again, we see a little bit more pushback. And this time it's actually a groundbreaking lawsuit because this is the first real company to push back against whether or not these impact fees are necessary.
Yeah, that's right. So she's the first person to sort of directly raise this issue in court of our municipalities within their rights to charge these kinds of fees in the very first place without a better basis for them, without being able to point to a specific impact and say, look, marijuana store, you had this impact on our community. You owe us X amount of dollars as a result of this specific thing. So she's really challenging the fundamental basis of this whole law, this whole fee system. And needless to say, the lawsuit is still sort of caught up in endless appeals and rulings going back and forth. But from my read, she's very much in the game here. The courts are taking this claim seriously. They're
Yeah.
not being laughed out of court, and I think the courts are going to give a real close look at whether municipalities actually have this power.
We will have an episode with her coming up where she discusses her whole story and how she got into this. So this really interests me because what I think we're seeing when we take a bit of a step back and we look at Northampton dropping their impact fees, Caroline trying to sue over impact fees, what I'm really seeing is a pushback against the opportunity of corruption in the state. And this sort of harkens back to 2019 when the mayor of Fall River was found to be extorting cannabis companies essentially to get one of the coveted licenses in his city. I love to watch this movement of back and forth between business owners and lawmakers about what is a fair industry. Why do we have to pay you this? Why do you get to say that we should hand over this money? What is it for? You need to list this out for us.
Yeah, that has been one of the biggest plot lines in marijuana in Massachusetts over the last 5 years. This whole question of just how far local control goes. And I think, on one hand, the Fall River case is an outlier. I don't think most municipal officials, or maybe even any other municipal officials, are corrupt on that level of,
Mm,
sitting in the back of the car, where's my briefcase of money kind of corruption.
mhm.
But clearly, it's an example of the kind of leverage that elected officials like former Fall River Mayor Hazel Correa have over this process, right? He wouldn't have been able to demand those